So hello and welcome to everyone who's online at the moment, and I'm sure we'll get some people joining in the next few minutes as well, so they'll jump in hopefully soon. I guess, yeah, thank you for being here today, and we're excited to be delivering our salary and job satisfaction survey data in the format of a webinar this year. I guess we're keeping along with the new ways of working with everything being online these days. So it's new for us as well. So just some housekeeping before I get started. Please use the chat function for any questions you have throughout the presentation. I know some people put some comments and questions in when they registered for the event, so I'll try and touch on those. I'll try and respond to any questions in the chat function in real time when we're on slides, but otherwise, if I don't, I will try and come back to it at the end of the presentation as well. And please note that there will be a recording of the webinar and a copy of the report sent to everyone here today following the presentation, or later this week at least. So I guess just to, oops, I'm looking at a different screen. There we go. So just to give some context around the survey and the data collected, the survey was conducted around June, July 2021. So partway through that period, we had the Sydney lockdown. So it's just helpful to keep that in mind when looking at the results, to be mindful of the headspace and the environment in which the survey was conducted. We had over 1,000 contributors across the entire survey, and this included just over 100 from Medical Affairs. I do group Medical Affairs and Pharmacovigilance together for the presentation, but I know that some companies have pharmacovigilance in a different department in their organisational structures. So looking at the slide, I guess it just gives you an idea of where the responses have come from. They're quite consistent across company size, so from small companies to large companies. In Medical Affairs, there's a pretty even split for gender, so that diagram is just more the general survey outcomes. So in Medical Affairs, we have about 44 and 56% male to female, and majority in Medical Affairs work for internationally owned companies. So it's actually 94% in Medical Affairs, as opposed to the 59% across the whole industry. And 92% of respondents were full-time employees in the medical affairs space. So looking at, again, the contributors to the survey, interestingly, at the time of survey, so June, July this year, 30% of respondents had been in their role for less than a year. And that means they'd made the change during COVID. So that was quite interesting to see. So whilst recruitment had generally slowed down across the whole industry since COVID, we did see that medical affairs and pharmacovigilance were two areas that continued to have consistent activity in the job market. I'll touch on this later on, but generally speaking, from a company perspective, there were job vacancies all the way through 2020 and 2021 in these sectors. But it was more difficult to source candidates, particularly during the first lockdown in 2020 and during the recent lockdown in 2021. So that just gives you an idea of the amount of time the employees have held in their current position in the survey. Looking at salary, remuneration and pay increases in the last 12 months, generally speaking, our sector in medical affairs is well looked after. The graphics here are from the whole industry. However, in medical affairs, over 80% received a pay increase in the past 12 months. And almost half of those increases, around 47%, were in the 3 to 4% range, so a bit higher than normal CPI. So generally a well looked after space. In medical affairs, the main reason a candidate didn't receive an increase was just due to being less than 12 months in their role. And the areas on the side here, like inadequate company performance, wasn't a top reason for medical affairs. So this is just more across our whole industry. Interestingly, only about 53 or 50% received a pay increase when changing jobs. I think we all expect this to be higher usually, because everyone wants a pay increase when they're changing positions. But for those who did receive an increase, the average increase was around 15% of their salary package. So that's still a fairly decent increase. I'm not too sure what happened to the other 47%. In regards to bonuses, in medical affairs, actually 83% received a bonus. So again, higher than the rest of the industry. And we often get asked about sign-on bonuses. So we've started to include that into our survey in the last couple of years. And in medical affairs, 15% received a sign-on bonus when changing jobs. And that bonus generally ranged from about $3,000 to $16,000, with mostly around that $10,000 mark. Usually sign-on bonuses we see for more senior positions or where the recruitment's occurring very close to an upcoming bonus in someone's current position that they would be walking away from, or that they wouldn't be eligible for a next bonus with the new company that they're going with. So usually those are the grounds for a sign-on bonus. The loyalty bonus captured here is not as relevant to the medical affairs space, but we saw it more in like the clinical research and CRO industries where there was a severe talent shortage in those areas. And in terms of benefits and the non-cash benefits that people receive and that people value, so flexible working and work from home is always top of the list. There's no surprise there. In medical affairs, this is generally become a standard across our industry. So most companies offer or receive this, and it's become a norm. And I think COVID has definitely pushed it to become even more of a norm these days. One thing to note is that further studies paid by the employer is part of the top valued benefits. So if your company offers this and you're recruiting, then it's worth promoting that to potential candidates. And also just to add that in medical affairs, the time off in lieu and on-site parking was also in the top 5 valued benefits. Again, I think with COVID, everyone preferring to drive perhaps than public transport, that's where the parking has come back into the picture. So moving on to the salary slides, this is just a preview of the salary tables that you'll receive in the report. I won't spend too much time on these slides just because we could be here all day dissecting all the figures, but I'll just go through it with you to give you an idea of what you'll be looking at and how to read the data. Of course, if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, I'm happy to go through and have more specific discussions around particular salaries. So this slide basically combines the data across all industries for each job title and actually compares it to the previous year. So you can see there's a key up here for 2021 and 2020 data. There's a first quartile, a median and a third quartile. There's just a comment on the average bonus received for those job titles. And where there's data missing, it just means that we only received 1 or 2 responses for that job title for that year. And if there's a job title missing, it just means we didn't get enough contributors for that job title. So for example, you'll see that there's a medical science liaison in here, but not a senior MSL title. So unfortunately, no data on the senior MSLs to report, but there is on the MSL. But happy to again comment on that to anyone after the presentation, just from our general industry knowledge and understanding of the salaries in the industry. The next few slides will break down by industry. So again, it's the same job titles as you saw before, but it just breaks it down by industry. And for medical affairs, it's mostly in that pharmaceutical ethical space. There might be a few others in there as well. So again, it just goes through the job titles. I guess in that previous one, maybe the one thing to note would be that the pharmacovigilance manager range, was quite a big range between first quartile and third quartile. But yeah, so if you have any questions around the numbers like that, just come back to me after the presentation. Yeah, so you can see again the same job titles going through. The other thing to comment on, just let you know, is that these figures are all package. So it's anything that is a guaranteed part of the package, so anything but bonus. So it would generally include base plus super, and if there's a car allowance, it will include a car allowance. So again, when looking at, say, the senior medical advisor at a 240 or 210, just keep in mind that take out the super and then take out if there is a car allowance or if there isn't, if you want to work out the base. So just moving on from the numbers into employee experience. So job satisfaction, I guess, in medical affairs, it's a generally satisfied cohort. Over 75% fall into the satisfied or very satisfied category. This is probably just a consideration for managers when looking to recruit, where people are generally quite satisfied in their job. There's generally a high sense of job security. People like what they do and they're very engaged. So, and this is consistent across men and women. So it's really great from a retention perspective, but it does make it more difficult when you're trying to recruit into your roles. And in terms of why people leave and reasons for staying, so people left for more money, for lack of job satisfaction and excessive workload in their previous roles. We find that in medical affairs, the lack of job satisfaction really is more around people seeking a new therapeutic area or a product launch in terms of the actual work that they're working on. So that would be part of their reasons to leave. And the reasons to stay are generally for flexibility that they already receive that is hard to match into from a next employer, supportive management and career development. Reasons to stay are, usually quite consistent each year, and things like flexibility and work from home arrangements make it quite difficult for a lot of people to let go of if the next company is not offering that or to the same extent. I've certainly had situations where candidates have got their whole life set up around, a certain schedule and structure, and it's very difficult to uproot all of that if they're not going to receive it in the next role that they're applying to. So just looking at hiring talent, so this might be more from a manager's perspective. So managers in medical affairs reported that over the past 6 months, so obtaining permanent headcount was more difficult. So again, if we think about this was captured in June, July, looking at the 6 months prior to that, where companies were making it a bit more difficult to get permanent headcount. On the flip side of that, the obtaining contractor headcount was a little bit easier. So we did see an increase in contracting roles in that period. And over the past 6 months, actually just attracting talent was more difficult in general. So that was definitely consistent with our experience as well in that period. And in the next 12 months, managers tell us that they either looking to increase headcount or remain the same. So generally that just signals that we can expect some growth in the sector and that the need for skills and resources is definitely present. In terms of candidates, so in medical affairs, almost half of candidates are not looking for a change and 1/3 are really sitting on the fence. These figures are from the whole data, but in medical affairs, it's almost half are not looking to change and 1/3 are sitting on the fence. So again, a very engaged and happy and satisfied cohort. Over 1/3 of respondents had applied for a new job in the previous 12 months, and over 1/3 actually received more than one job offer. So interestingly, that just reinforces the competitiveness of the market and the increased demand for candidates that we're seeing as well from our perspective as recruiters. And about 2/3 in medical affairs were successful in obtaining a new position. in that. So from a recruitment perspective, around a quarter of managers said that they had offered a job to someone who had then declined the offer. So again, it just reinforces that competitiveness, and I'm sure many managers here today might have experienced that as well. The reasons in medical affairs are pretty consistent with the data here, but counter offers appear to be less. So it was lower in medical affairs than the rest of the sector. I'm not sure what that implies. And half of job vacancies take about 6 to 10 weeks to fill in medical affairs. So if you're looking at recruiting and you're planning and, you know, backwards planning or forward planning, that's the sort of timeframes that we're generally looking at. And that would include someone's notice period as well. Remote working and views and preferences. So you're going to get all these slides in the report you receive, so I won't go through this in a lot of detail. But in medical affairs, essentially 80% of employees prefer a hybrid arrangement of work from home and office, which is not surprising. And managers generally prefer to retain some control or decide on a case-by-case basis. However, the percentage of managers who have no preference has increased since the pandemic. I think the pandemic showed that productivity didn't really drop with work from home, and perhaps it's the fact that companies have facilitated and invested in effective work from home strategies and technologies and processes, that it's actually become a much more practical arrangement to have than perhaps before. Again, just the productivity and engagement living with COVID has remained the same or increased, which is quite positive. By the way, I'm not sure if anyone's had any questions so far. I haven't seen anything in the chat function come through, so I'm just going to...
Raha, no questions so far.
Okay, good. No, I'm just realizing I'm powering through the presentation and and no questions yet. So just moving on. So hiring remote workers. Yeah, so change in employers' views in terms of hiring remote employees. 40% already hire remote employees in medical affairs. And that's just wanting to see whether people would consider hiring in Melbourne for a Sydney-based job or vice versa, and whether there's been any more flexibility in that. And what we've started to ask questions around wellbeing, again, around the whole mental health and COVID and everything that goes along with that. So I think the overall feedback is that everyone is somewhat stressed or is just finding it challenging to keep up with their workloads. Overwhelmingly, the responses we receive focus on the lack of resource or the lack of staffing to meet the needs and the need for companies to perhaps provide more resource or support to alleviate some of that stress and workload. And we see this even when it comes to hiring. More and more companies and managers want candidates to, you know, hit the ground running and already come with all the training and experience that's needed for the job, rather than perhaps looking a little bit more broadly outside of you know, someone who ticks every single box, but looking at someone who's got transferable skills or great potential. And I think that really just is because everyone is so time and resource poor, and they feel they can't really afford to spend that extra time training someone, you know, a few more months than perhaps getting someone already in with the experience. So we see that both from the candidate's perspective and managers when we're recruiting. And I guess just, you know, it's nice to know that everyone feels comfortable to share, well, most people feel comfortable to share their concerns around wellbeing in the workplace. So that's just a light note to include. So workload and related stress, feeling concerned for their mental wellbeing and unsafe at work. So just being comfortable to raise these, particularly work from home and feeling a bit more isolated in these new working arrangements. It's important to feel that you can still approach your manager or your employer and share those concerns. And that's actually the end of my presentation. So I don't know if I just powered through it more quickly than I should have, or perhaps it, you know, we're a lot more efficient. But I guess just to reinforce that everyone will get a copy of this presentation and report. But yeah, can I welcome any questions to come through if anyone has any? That would be a good time to share it. I'm just trying to think if there's anything I missed in that. Catherine,
thanks, Raha. It's Catherine O'Mahony here. I'm just, while we're waiting for people to ask questions, you know, I've noticed what's your opinion in medical affairs? Everybody's talking about the great wave of resignation that's going to happen next year. Are your clients predicting that in 2022, or your thoughts on what you're hearing in the marketplace for medical affairs?
Look, I think our industry is generally a bit more protected than others, and medical affairs particularly as well. It's perhaps different to some of the more commercial areas and that. So I think it's quite protected to those big fluctuations that we might see across the rest of the workforce and industry. But I think what we would probably see more of is a lot of holidays. So everyone's been waiting patiently for borders to open. So actually there might be more stress on resource as a result of everyone taking a long overdue leave, extended leave, a lot of people wanting to go overseas to visit family. And already even in some of the more recent recruitment activities we've had, or recent assignments, candidates have been negotiating that up front to say, I'm going to be going away for a month during my probation period, and I want to know that that's going to be accepted by the next employer if I'm coming on board. So that's definitely something I think we will see in the next sort of first half of next year or so on. Yeah.
So I can't see anybody asking any questions, Raha. I think maybe your presentation was so. I've just had somebody say to me that they can't they can't use the chat function to write a question. So I'm not sure, Tufa, our head of marketing, that's probably why, because normally the medical affairs group asks loads of questions.
So let me check. So the chat show conversation button is right at the top of the panel, like in the top panel. So if you click on the chat function, let me just.
Maybe that's why, that probably explains. I was surprised not to have any questions during this time.
But let me see. Yeah.
But that's okay. Look, anyone who does have questions, I'm happy to answer them after this. So everyone's got my email address and phone number. Again, with the salary, I think everyone wants to go into a bit more detail around salary. It's just everyone's got a different job title in mind to look at, and that would take a long time in a group setting. But generally speaking, there wasn't anything too surprising in the salaries, I would say, other than, I mean, there's nuance.
Sorry, Raha, sorry to interrupt. I think the questions are coming through.
Yeah, so. They're working now, Raha. Yeah. Raha, there's one question from Dave Ali. He said, has there been a question for workload to increase during the pandemic while working from home?
Feels like it. Yes, I guess a lot of comment we're receiving is that there's a blurred line between, you know, home and work life with work from home. But I think that's quite positive, because then you cut out your commute time. So there's pros and cons to both. In regards to the actual workload increasing, I think a lot of times people have said to me that because their day's filled with so many Teams and Zooms and you know, online sessions, as opposed to just being able to go up to someone, that then shortens your time available to actually complete your work as well. So yeah, there probably has been an increase in workload, but that's a good point. We can compare that to perhaps last year's data or previous year's data and see what comes out of that.
Raha, There's a second question here from Chrissa. She
Yes.
said, is the salary data across all states or is it heavily Sydney based?
The data is from all states, but we do get a much higher proportion of contributors from Sydney. So what I can do, and we do actually have that somewhere, is the breakdown by state in terms of respondents. So I can actually find that to see what the split is as well.
Yeah,
There is sometimes a difference in salary between Sydney and other states. Sydney tending to be a little bit higher usually.
Okay, good. Another question here from Rosemary. What do you attribute the increased demand due to? Example, is it fewer candidates or increased workload?
Yeah, I guess, is that the increased demand for like recruitment demand, I'm guessing, is what that refers to. But yeah, so what we found during COVID, so 2020 and 2021, particularly during lockdown periods, was that there were fewer candidates in the market, which made it quite competitive and quite difficult to recruit. I don't think there was necessarily an increased, in medical affairs at least, not necessarily an increased workload per se. The workload followed launches and other activities that are part of the sort of like the natural life cycle, for those teams. But yeah, probably fewer candidates in terms of candidate mobility made it more difficult to recruit and increase the demand for them.
Okay, good. Another question here, Raha, was from do you see any differences in salary between consulting firms and pharmaceutical companies?
That's a really good question. I think we need to go back to the data and see what we got from consulting firms. I don't know if we get a lot of data in medical affairs from consulting firms. But I'd have to check that and come back to that one, I think. Catherine, unless you know off the top of your head.
Yeah, look, my only comment on that would be, I think consulting firms have more flexibility. So if they decide, or the leadership group or the executive group decide they want to, they're not constrained by, so they might watch their salaries more closely, but if it's the right person, they can go outside the salary banding more easily than the large to medium-sized multinationals who must stay within the HR salary banding and do a lot more due diligence for internal relativity. So I think it's a bit of both, really. It depends on the company, how desperately they need it. I don't know what you think, Raha, but I think we've seen with consulting firms, I've observed that you're getting a lot more sort of contracting roles from the consulting firms.
Yes. Yeah. For independent contractors and fixed term contractors. Yes, correct.
Raha, another question here. For respondents changing roles and not receiving a pay increase. So that's for candidates who are changing roles and not receiving a pay increase. Are you seeing a general flatlining of salaries, or is it more a reflection of the cohort?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm really surprised to see that there was that many people not receiving a pay increase when changing roles. I don't think I've worked on an assignment recently where the candidate didn't want a pay increase or didn't have a reason for it. So that was a really interesting piece of data to see. But am I seeing a general flatlining of salaries? I think it depends on the role. The roles where there was more demand in, there was definitely more waiting on the candidate side to push for salaries. But perhaps roles that there's not been as much demand in lately might be. So it's a really difficult one to answer as to where there's a flatlining of salaries. I think we kind of need to see that maybe in a couple of years consecutively to see if there's been that change. But in my personal experience recruiting and doing assignments, I've not seen a flatlining of salaries.
Thank you. Raha, could I just comment? Holistically, we've seen in the last 12, 18 months right across the business candidates, and that's borne out by the data, getting multiple offers. Do you think in medical affairs there's more candidates receiving more offers, or what we call also ghosting, where they accept an offer and then don't come back? I haven't seen that from what you've communicated, but just interested. We've definitely seen it in the other sectors.
Yeah, so I think medical affairs, we haven't seen the ghosting, but we definitely, you're right, Catherine, we have seen that in other sectors across our business. So that's quite, you know, it's disappointing to see, but not in medical affairs. I haven't seen ghosting, and I haven't had companies or managers comment that they've been ghosted by their candidates. But certainly the multiple offers is a common one, which I guess just brings it back to that competitiveness of the market. There's fewer candidates than there are roles. So it's just natural that they're going to have more offers on the table. And for medical affairs, the drivers tend to be more around product, therapeutic area, those sorts of, I guess, factors. Salary is still very important in this sector as well. So I don't think I've seen too many people who wouldn't consider salary as one of their deciding factors if they had a few on the table.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Just wondering if there's there's another question, Raha, from Mark. Are you seeing a blurring of roles between sales roles and MSLs as driven by change in access over the past 18 months due to COVID-19?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one because, you know, access has been more difficult during COVID, particularly for commercial teams. So there has been, I guess, a greater push for MSLs to fill that gap. But yeah, so I think that would be something we need to see long term if the actual roles get blurred. But I know that there has been a lot more focus on MSLs gaining access in the ways that they can to bridge some of that gap that's been felt by the sales team. So,
yeah.
And I think also it's a factor of whether someone's been in that industry, in that market for a long time in their role, whether as an MSL or a salesperson, and they have the relationships in place. So it's very easy to transition to an online way of connecting with KOLs and customers, whereas for anyone new in these roles, it's actually, the feedback is it's very difficult to establish those first relationships and build the relationships from scratch when you don't have as much face-to-face time with these
Fantastic.
customers.
Yeah, great, wonderful. So Raha, so far I don't, just to the audience, if are there any more questions to Raha? Now is your chance.
Yeah, again, happy to have a more detailed discussion with anyone afterwards as well. But if there's anything that we've presented on today or general comments, happy to answer them now too.
Wonderful. So to reaffirm, you'll send out the webinar link and the report to all the attendees.